Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is a tutorial on using the Autopilot installed in the 172 Classic. Although this particular model of Autopilot is only installed on the 172 Classic or steam gauge panel, the functions and features are similar to what you will find on the autopilots of most of the light aircraft in the game, including G1000 panels and even light turboprops. A fundamental understanding of its operation will set you up well for using cockpit automation in all kinds of aircraft, from light aircraft to heavy jets. Although the model information has removed on the unit and flight simulator, the model is a Bendix King KAP 140 two-axis autopilot with altitude pre-select. By two-axis, it means they can control the aircraft in roll and pitch, but not yaw or throttle, and it has no flight director like is present on the G1000 panels. Although it's not difficult to find a manual for this autopilot on the internet, the manual includes data for a few different models, and many of the features of the real autopilot either don't work in Flight Simulator or they work differently. So you can download the manual, but it may not give you a lot of good information to work with. The functions of the autopilot include a wing leveler, the ability to turn to and hold a heading, the ability to track a VOR, GPS, or localizer course, the ability to track a localizer back course or track a localizer course while flying outbound from a runway, although the tracking of a localizer back course does not work super great in Flight Simulator, at least from my personal experience. Climbing or descending at a specified vertical speed, holding an altitude, capturing a pre-selected altitude, and tracking an ILS glide slope. Controls on the KAP 140 include an autopilot engage and disengage button, heading mode selector, navigation mode selector, approach mode selector, back course approach mode selector, altitude hold mode select button, vertical trim buttons, altitude pre-select knobs, an altitude arm button that doesn't work in Flight Simulator, and a BARO set button that doesn't work very well in Flight Simulator. The display on the autopilot is divided into several different sections, including roll mode display, autopilot engaged annunciation, pitch mode display, altitude pre-select and vertical speed display, and altitude alerter. So let's talk about powering up the autopilot and pre-flight of the autopilot. The autopilot is powered from the bus 1 side of the avionics master switch. It will also power up automatically anytime you drop into Flight Simulator in other than a cold and dark state. And the only time you're going to get a cold and dark state is if you if you start your simulator session on the ramp. If you started on the runway or in flight, the avionics master will already be turned on, and that will power up the autopilot. The unit goes through a self-test when it's first powered up. This takes just under 30 seconds to complete, and the autopilot is not usable during this time. It will do this self-test regardless of whether you power up with the avionics master or by dropping into your session in a powered up state. Let's go ahead and power it up and see what that self-test looks like. You can see it on the display, it shows PFT, and then it has a number over here, and that counts up to 5. Once it gets to 5, it lights up the entire display. All the annunciators are lit up, and then it will stay like that for just a couple of seconds, and it'll sound the autopilot disconnect tone. And then once that tone sounds, it'll show a 0 over here on the altitude pre-select window, and the altitude alert will be on, and we know it's ready to use. There is the autopilot disconnect tone, 0 feet on the altitude pre-select display, and then the alerter is on. And honestly, I don't know that would be on if we were higher than 1,000 feet, because it only comes on within 800 feet of whatever's in the pre-select window. So I have to try that out at a higher field sometime. One little note about the power-up is that if you drop into Flight Simulator in flight, if you start your session flying in the air, it will go through this self-test, and then it will automatically engage the autopilot, and it will engage it in the wing leveler roll mode, but no vertical mode. So the autopilot will automatically engage, and you'll either have to disconnect it or set it up for what you want to do. There's not really any pre-flight test that's necessary for the autopilot in Flight Simulator. In the real airplane, you can turn on the autopilot and you can turn the heading bug, and then you can make sure the servos are working, because it will actually turn the control yoke on the ground, but it won't do that in Flight Simulator. In fact, I recommend against turning on the autopilot at all on the ground, because if you do that, it will move your trim wheel and put you out of trim for takeoff, so I don't recommend that. There are a couple of good practices to use before you take off with the autopilot, though, to have it set up and ready to go once you get airborne. The first is to set the altitude either that you're initially cleared to or you're initially planning to climb to in the altitude pre-select field here. That will get you set up for when you want to turn the autopilot on, and it will also serve as a reminder of what altitude you're cleared to. The altitude pre-select function is pretty straightforward. The big knob is thousands of feet, and the little knob is hundreds of feet. So you can set it like that, and like I said, it just serves as a reminder and gets you set up. It's also a good idea to have the heading bug set up to runway heading. Heading bug works pretty straightforward. Just roll it to the heading that you want to put it on, and that's the heading that the autopilot is going to fly. So put it either to runway heading or the heading that you think you're going to use once you get airborne and are going to want to use the autopilot. One last thing I'll say about the autopilot before we get in the air and start playing around with the functions is that I recommend the first time that you engage the autopilot, you do it in level flight, and definitely not after takeoff. The reason I say this is because the default vertical mode when you engage the autopilot in Flight Simulator is a vertical speed hold of 0 feet per minute. So when you first turn it on, that's what it's going to do, and if you're climbing out on takeoff, that will stop your climb, and if you're down kind of low, that can get a little sporty. We will talk about a way to engage it while you're on the takeoff climb out. You do have to be a little quick in getting it into a decent vertical speed mode, but we will talk about how to do that after we go through the basic engagement functions. The autopilot can be engaged by pressing the Autopilot Engage button, or it can also be engaged by using the toggle autopilot master control if you have that bound to a control on your joystick or your keyboard, which I highly recommend once you start flying airplanes with autopilots. The engagement is indicated by the illumination of the Autopilot Engage annunciator, which is in the middle of the display window here. The default roll mode that it goes into is the wing leveler mode, which this roll mode, all it does is if you're in attitude other than wings level, it will roll your wings to level and then it will hold them there. And you can tell we're in the wing leveler mode by the roll mode annunciator enunciating ROL. The default vertical mode, once you turn the autopilot on, is a vertical speed hold mode of 0 feet per minute. And you can see when we first turn on the autopilot, it shows VS in the pitch mode indicator window, and then it shows 0 feet per minute initially in the altitude pre-select and vertical speed indication window. And so it's just going to hold us at a vertical speed of 0. If you want to engage your autopilot after takeoff or in a climb or in a descent, the way to do it is you hit the autopilot engagement button and note your vertical speed before you do this. Hit the autopilot engagement button and then very quickly use your vertical trim buttons to select approximately the vertical speed that you were doing before you turn the autopilot on, and that should establish it in that climb, and will minimize the amount of time that you stop the climb. Because of this little quirk in the Flight Simulator autopilot, there's not a limitation in the manual for the autopilot of a minimum engagement height, but good standard practice for most autopilots is to be at least 500 feet off the ground before you engage the autopilot, and that's what I would recommend here. Higher is better. 1,000 feet is probably preferable, but if you're quick enough, you can get it on after 500 feet without getting too close to the terrain. There are 3 ways to turn the autopilot off. The first is to hit the autopilot engagement button again. The second is to use the toggle autopilot master control if you have that bound to a control on your keyboard or joystick or mouse or whatever. And the final one, although it is not recommended, is to use the control wheel to overpower the servos. If you do that, the autopilot will automatically disconnect. You have to be pretty abrupt for it to work in Flight Simulator, but it will work and the autopilot will turn off when you do that. When you disconnect the autopilot, you'll get an autopilot disconnect warning tone. And then everything but the altitude pre-select display will go blank. So that's how you know the autopilot has been turned off. Alright, so let's talk about the roll modes that are available to us on the autopilot. We've already talked about the wing leveler mode, so the next mode is the heading hold mode. We can engage that by pushing the heading mode select button. And we know we're in the heading hold mode by the roll mode display displaying HDG. And we can actually use the heading mode select button to toggle between the heading hold mode and the wing leveler. So each time we hit that, it'll toggle between those 2 modes. The heading hold mode does exactly what you would expect it to do. It will roll to and hold the heading that you select with the heading bug, the red heading bug, on the directional gyro. One note of caution, though, is that it will always take the shortest path to get to that heading, regardless of which way you turn the bug. So let's say you're taking off out of an airport that has mountainous terrain to the southwest, and the departure procedure has you doing a left turn around to a heading of 300 to avoid that terrain. It doesn't matter which way I turn the bug and how fast I turn it. If I turn it pretty quickly over to a 300 heading, initially it'll do the turn to the left, but then it'll stop and think about it for a second and go, hey, wait. Going to 300 will be faster if I turn the other way. So if you need to do something like that, what you want to do is roll it slowly. Let's see here, let's get back on a 180 heading here. But you want to roll it slowly to something just shy of that 180 degree point. So we could roll it, say, left to about a 030, 020 heading. And then once the heading that you actually want comes around, past that 180 degree point, 330 is coming through right now. So now I can go ahead and roll it all the way to that 330 heading, and that's how we can get it to turn in the direction that we want it to, even if it's a turn of more than 180 degrees. The next mode we'll talk about is the VOR or GPS tracking and the nav tracking mode. And the way this works is that if you are flying on a VOR course or a GPS course, or even tracking a localizer front course inbound, you can activate this mode and it will track and hold that course. It'll make corrections to keep you on course. So I've got a VOR dialed in here, and I'm showing to about a 013 or so bearing to the station. And if I hit the nav mode selector, that'll throw the throw the autopilot into nav hold mode. So now it will track that course. It'll keep it centered up for me, and it will track that to the VOR. I could put a direct waypoint into the GPS as well and switch this over to GPS, and we'll also track my GPS course. In fact, if you have a flight plan in the GPS, it will actually track the GPS course through all the course changes. It will actually change course for you. And we know that the nav mode has been activated by NAV displaying on the roll mode display. And that is how the nav function works. One more thing to say about the navigation mode is that if it can no longer navigate off that signal for any particular reason, it will default to the wing level mode. It'll revert to that mode. So for instance, I've got a VOR tuned in here. If I were to detune that VOR, you see it can no longer navigate, so it reverts to the wing level mode. And I have to select another mode to get it back into a different mode. Reasons that it would do this is if you pass the last GPS waypoint on your flight plan or the point you're navigating direct to, now it doesn't know where else to go. It'll go back into wing level mode. If you lose the signal like I just did off the VOR or a localizer, if you fly out of range of that signal, or also if you're passing over the VOR, if you're getting into the cone of confusion, when you pass, if you're flying a radial into a VOR and then navigating on the same radial or the opposite radial on the way out of the VOR, you can't just leave it in nav and pass over the station. It's going to revert into wing level mode, or you're going to have to put it into heading mode. And then on the other side of the VOR, you'll have to re-engage the navigation mode. So one thing that the autopilot in Flight Simulator, at least on this airplane, does not do well is intercepting of courses. It typically, particularly for VOR courses, it uses an overly aggressive intercept angle that you can't control. And then because of that, it then starts doing S-turns about the radial once it's kind of gotten itself on course. I've set up a little demonstration to show you what I'm talking about here. I've got myself on a course, an airway going out of Pine Bluff VOR to Texarkana VOR. It's on the 244 radial off of Pine Bluff, and I've put that also in the GPS so you can see where the course is and how far off I am. I'm currently 2.4 miles to the north of the course. Normally, the course deviation of that scale, you only need about a 20 or 30 degree intercept to go and get that course. You can see I'm roughly paralleling the course right now. So I will put in about a 20 degree intercept here, and I'm in heading mode, so it'll roll over to that, and then I'll engage the nav mode. And in the real autopilot, what you would do is you'd put it in roll mode at that point, and then you'd arm the nav, and then it would maintain that wings level until it was on course. So I've rolled out on my heading here. I'm going to go ahead and arm the nav, and you'll see what it's going to do is it's going to get very aggressive. It's going to hard bank over there to capture the course. And then so it's going to really overdo it. It's going to put an overly aggressive intercept in there. So the better technique is to steer yourself onto a course with your heading, and then once you're actually on course, turn your heading so that you're basically tracking the course with your heading, and then activate nav. It does seem to do a little bit better with GPS courses. I have not tried it with localizer courses yet, but with the VORs, it's way over aggressive. It's putting basically a 40 or 50 degree intercept to correct a small course deviation there, so a little over aggressive on that. Final roll mode we'll talk about is the back course approach mode. This mode can track a localizer back course inbound for a localizer back course approach, or track a localizer front course outbound for navigation. Although in Flight Simulator it does not work very well for a localizer back course. It generally has. I've tested that a few times, and it does a good job of tracking a localizer front course outbound. You'll see that occasionally in departure procedures, where they'll have you take off and then track a localizer front course outbound for navigation, and it does a pretty good job of that. But for flying a back course approach, I don't recommend using the back course mode. It's kind of all over the place and seems to not really track it very well. So an alternative technique for flying a back course approach is just to do it in heading mode, and then use the heading to keep yourself on the back course approach course. You activate this mode by pressing the back course approach mode selector, which is the REV button. Not sure why it doesn't say BC like every other back course approach button in the world, but it doesn't. It's the REV button, and it will be enunciated with the REV in the roll mode selector, or roll mode displayed, excuse me. And just like the other roll modes, this will revert to wing level mode, or ROL, when the station is passed, or if you lose the signal, or if you detune the frequency that you're using to track it. And you can get it out of the back course approach mode by selecting any other roll mode. Preferably, you wouldn't want to select nav because that's going to try to track a front course, which won't work, but heading or wing leveler mode, either one of those will work. All right, let's talk a little bit about the vertical modes that are available on the Autopilot. We've already talked about the vertical speed mode a little bit, which is the default that the Autopilot goes into when we turn the Autopilot on. And we'll go into more depth on this mode here in just a minute. The other mode that's available to us is the altitude hold mode. And what that mode does is it holds the current altitude the aircraft is at when that mode is selected. So if you're level at an altitude, it will hold that altitude. If you're climbing or descending, it will hold the altitude that you're crossing through when you hit that button. So that's kind of useful if you encounter traffic or something like that and you want to level off quickly. You just press that button and it will level you off at that altitude. You activate the altitude hold mode by pressing the altitude hold mode select button. This button actually toggles between the altitude hold mode and the vertical speed hold mode. And we know we're in altitude hold mode when ALT is enunciated on the pitch mode display. One more thing to note about the altitude hold mode, and that is that if you are in a climb or a descent and you hit the altitude hold mode, it will automatically readjust your altitude pre-select setting to whatever altitude it is holding. Okay, so let's take a look at the vertical speed hold mode and the altitude capture function. Again, the vertical speed mode is the default pitch mode when the Autopilot is initially engaged, and the altitude hold mode select button toggles between this mode and the altitude hold mode. You know you're in vertical speed mode when VS is enunciated in the pitch mode display. Once you activate the vertical speed mode, the pitch trim buttons can be used to adjust to the desired vertical speed, and then you have to manually control the power during the climb or the descent. This can be used in conjunction with the altitude pre-select function to capture an altitude. It will capture an altitude if the vertical speed that you set in there will eventually result in you obtaining that altitude. If the vertical speed will not result in you eventually encountering that altitude, then it will just continue that climb or descent indefinitely until it either hits the ground or runs out of engine power to continue the climb and stalls. So an example of that is if I wanted to initiate a descent, let's say to 1,500 feet, so I dial in 1,500 feet in the altitude pre-select display, and then I use the vertical trim buttons and I put a descent in there, and you'll notice that eventually that'll show the vertical speed momentarily, and then it'll revert back to the altitude pre-select display. And eventually, because I am descending and I'm going to encounter that altitude, it will automatically capture that altitude and then revert to altitude hold mode when I get to that altitude. If, however, I put in an altitude that's higher than my current altitude, I'm never going to get to that altitude while I'm doing a descent. So the system is just going to continue the descent indefinitely until it hits the ground. One little caveat about using the vertical speed and altitude pre-select mode is that if you are at the altitude that is in your altitude pre-select window and you go into vertical speed, it oftentimes will not initiate a climb or descent. Basically what happens is you put it in vertical speed, you just try to start a climb or descent, and the system immediately basically captures the altitude because it's at the altitude that's in the altitude pre-select window. It says, hey, I'm already there, and captures it, goes back into altitude hold mode. So if you want to initiate a climb or descent, you need to have something other than your current altitude, preferably, at least a few hundred feet away from your current altitude in this window. Once a climb or descent is initiated, The altitude pre-select window momentarily goes to display the desired vertical speed, but then it will revert back to the altitude pre-select window. You can still adjust your vertical speed though just by using the vertical trim buttons, and it will bring the vertical speed display back up momentarily, but then revert back to the altitude pre-select display. One caution is that the system will try to do any vertical speed you set in here. So you can try to make this airplane climb at 3,000 feet a minute or 2,500 feet a minute, but there is no stall protection. It will fly you right into a stall. So be careful what you put in here. The pilots will often refer to these older systems as dumb and dutiful. They will happily do whatever you ask them to do, even if it means flying the airplane into a stall or flying the airplane into the ground. So be careful what you ask for. There is an altitude alert function that is just below the altitude pre-select display. It comes on within 1,000 feet prior to your selected altitude. There it came on just there, and it extinguishes 200 feet from the selected altitude. It is a visual alert only. There's no audio tone associated with it. It's just a light that comes on the panel, basically. Okay, so let's step through the procedures for doing a climb in the vertical speed mode. So currently I'm in heading hold on a heading of 180 and in altitude hold at 3,500 feet. I want to do a climb, just a quick climb to 4,500 feet. So I will roll in 4,500 feet into my altitude pre-select mode, into my altitude pre-select display. I will select vertical speed, and then I'll use a reasonable speed for this aircraft. I'll put in 500 feet per minute. I have to manually adjust the power, so I will put in full power for the climb. Aircraft initiates a 500 foot per minute descent, or excuse me, climb, and then it reverts back to the altitude hold display. If I want to adjust the vertical speed, I can do that by pressing the vertical trim buttons and changing that. It will momentarily go to a vertical speed display and then go back to the altitude pre-select display. The altitude alerter comes on 1,000 feet prior to the selected altitude, so pretty much came on immediately after I initiated the climb, since I was within 1,000 feet. And then that'll go off at 200 feet prior to level off. So we just keep an eye on the airplane, make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to. Keep an eye on your speed to make sure that you're not asking too much in the vertical speed department, and then it will automatically capture when it gets to 4,500 feet. So there's 200 feet prior, the altitude alerter goes off, and it has started to capture the altitude. You can tell it's gone into altitude hold mode now. So now it's just, it takes a little bit of time for it to do that last 100 feet. It really kind of milks that climb for the last couple hundred feet. And then once you're level at the altitude, don't forget to reset your power back to your cruise power. And that is how you do a climb with this autopilot in the 172. Procedures for descent are pretty much exactly the same, except we'll be using a vertical speed down. So I'll go ahead and select 3,500 feet per minute in there. I'll select the vertical speed mode and put a 500 foot per minute descent rate in there. And then don't forget to adjust your power so you don't overspeed on the way down. Altitude alerter came on to let us know that we're within 1,000 feet of the altitude. I can still adjust my vertical speed just by using the vertical trim buttons. And then once it captures the altitude, it'll let us know by displaying ALT in the vertical mode display. And just don't forget to readjust your power for cruise once it's leveled back off. One other little note about the altitude pre-select mode is that I said earlier in the video that this BARO function does not work very well. Well, really it doesn't work at all, and that causes some problems with capturing altitudes if your altimeter setting is not standard if it's not 2992. It'll be minimal if it's not very far off, but if you get up to 0.5 inches off on the altimeter setting, that's an altitude error of up to 500 feet, and a little bit greater if pressure goes above or below 0.5 from standard. So to show you what I'm talking about here, I currently have the autopilot in heading hold and altitude hold, and it has captured an altitude selection of 3,500 feet, but the pressure is 995.75, which is an altimeter setting of 2942, so 0.5 off of standard. And so the altimeter is indicating correctly, and you can see it is holding a pressure altitude of 3,500 feet, but that is an indicated or actual altitude of 3,000 feet. So it does not capture that correctly. And there is a BARO function in here. You press the BARO and it brings up the altimeter setting, and I can roll it down, it takes a little while, to 995, but it doesn't make any corrections. So this does not function, and it doesn't correct that because it should be correcting back to 3,500 feet now, but it's still just holding that pressure altitude. Your two options that you can use to work around this are either to set the pressure to standard, which might be a problem if you're using live weather. It won't let you do that. The other option is to just use the vertical speed mode and the altitude hold mode to hold your altitude. Just be aware that the altitude pre-select function will indicate the wrong altitude when you level off. If I pressed altitude hold when I'm at this indicated altitude of 3,000, it would automatically revert to the altitude I'm at, but it will do the pressure altitude, so it's going to say 3,500 feet. But you can just, you can manually control the altitude basically by pressing the altitude hold function when you get to the altitude you want to hold. Just be aware that the number in this window is going to be incorrect. So those are the two workarounds for this little simism in the autopilot. The last mode we want to talk about is the approach mode. It is both a roll and a pitch mode, and it enables the autopilot to track an ILS localizer and capture and track an ILS glide slope. So it will basically fly an ILS for you. The technique for setting this up is generally to get on the localizer using heading mode and then track the localizer using nav mode. And then once you're established on the localizer, and if you're working with ATC, once you're cleared for the approach, go ahead and arm the approach mode, and you do that by pressing the approach mode selector. Once you arm the mode, the heading mode indicator will indicate APR, which means it's armed. It's now tracking the tracking the localizer, and it will capture and track the glide slope once it intercepts it. If you want to disable the approach prior to glide slope intercept, just select another roll mode, and that will disarm the approach mode. So as the autopilot intercepts the glide slope, the pitch mode display will go blank. I don't think this is how the system is supposed to operate on the real system. I believe it indicates GS to indicate it's tracking glide slope, but you'll notice when it intercepts the glide slope, it will go blank. And we'll see it pitch down and start to track the glide slope. So you know it's tracking the glide slope at that point. The approach mode and the roll mode window stays on. So there it goes. It's pitching down. We do have to control configuration and power to keep it on speed, and then we just monitor the system and make sure that it's staying on the glide slope appropriately. As far as proper technique, you should disengage the autopilot no later than 200 feet above the ground, or the ILS decision height altitude, which is typically 200 feet. If you want to experiment with keeping it on later than that, what I found that it will track the glide slope pretty well to about 100 feet, and then it kind of just comes down at about a 300 or 400 foot per minute rate after that. It actually does a pretty good job of tracking the localizer all the way to the ground. If you do leave it on all the way to the ground, it's not going to flare. It's going to go into the runway at about 300 or 400 feet per minute, and it's going to do it at a flat attitude. So you'll potentially end up with a flat landing and potentially a hard landing, so it's not a good technique. The best technique for executing a missed approach, especially near decision height on an ILS with the autopilot, is just to turn the autopilot off and fly at least to a reasonable altitude. If you try to mess with the vertical modes, what will happen is it will go into altitude hold mode and automatically altitude hold mode at the altitude you're at, and that is not a good thing when you're only a couple hundred feet off the ground. So again, the best thing is to just get the autopilot off, get yourself climbing, get to a reasonable altitude, and get the autopilot back on again. And again, you can disengage it. I like to use the autopilot toggle master control, and again to a key on the joystick so it's easy to turn off. And but you can also do it with the autopilot disengage button. I would not try to override the servos at a low altitude. You don't want to get yourself into an unusual attitude at 200 feet off the ground in a low visibility condition. That is not a recipe for success. So that finishes up our lesson on the autopilot on the Cessna 172 Classic. Like I said at the beginning of the lesson, many of the features that are on this autopilot are common to other autopilots, even up into large complex airplanes. So hopefully this sets you up not only with a good understanding of how this unit works, but a good foundation on learning how to use cockpit automation in more complex airplanes in the future. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.